Hello and welcome to Aston Originals. Colston Four, what does their acquittal mean for the future is the show today. I'm joined by Dr. Brian Sudlow, Graeme Hayes as well. Brian, if you'd like to introduce yourself, I know you've been on the channel before, but it doesn't hurt.
Thank you, Sam. So I'm Brian Sudlow. I'm a lecturer in history at Aston University, and I focus on history of technology and also global history as well these days.
And Graeme?
Yeah, and I'm Graeme Hayes. Nice to see you again. I'm head of the Department of Sociology and Policy, and I work on social movements, social protests, and on the trials of social movement activists. And,
so we shouldn't be too surprised to see that you were at the trial of the Colston Four, the so-called Colston Four.
Yeah.
Firstly, how was it?
I think it's always really interesting to be in court to see how things play out. We were in the public gallery, and in that particular court, that was separated by it was on a different floor from the court, so you were actually looking down through glass into the courtroom, and we were situated directly above the jury, so we couldn't see the jury's reaction to different points that were being made, but you could still kind of get a sense and get the temperature of what was going on. And I think particularly after some of the evidence presented by the defendants and the witnesses that the defendants call, I think we got a real sense that that they were probably going to be found not guilty. And so we weren't that surprised when the verdict came through. Of course, there was lots of noise in the public gallery when it happened, and outside in the courtroom, and I think long into the night. I was getting the train back to Birmingham, but it was really, you really did get a sense of, I think, the importance of it, certainly within Bristol. And you got a sense really of a lot of really quite important arguments, things which haven't really been talked about too much in the national media, but about property, for instance, about what constitutes property, and about slavery and property, and about the role of not just of Edward Colston, but perhaps an entire sense of the civic character of Bristolian society being played out. And so it was, it was fascinating to be there. And as I say, I don't think it was as big a shock in the end as perhaps some of the press reaction made it out to be.
It's an really interesting case, isn't it? Would you say that this is a groundbreaking trial?
Jury trials are, legally are never, they can never break new ground because they refer only to the case. So there were some interesting aspects of it in the legal situation, and one of these is about the application of the Ziegler finding by the Supreme Court about the balancing of rights, so the proportionate nature of rights. About whether activists can use this as a lawful excuse to say that they are exercising their freedom of speech, freedom of expression rights. So in that sense, it was groundbreaking, perhaps in perhaps a slightly marginal and still properly to be tested type of way. I think what is interesting is that the defence throughout the case were very, very keen to say, this is only about Bristol, this is only about this statue. I'm not necessarily so sure. I do think that as public commemoration, as statues have become central to the type of politics which surrounds us in Britain at the moment, that there will be at least ripples from this. And I do think that one of the key arguments that the defence made, which was that the public representation of someone who is effectively a mass murderer through their deep involvement in slavery. I mean, he was referred to by one of the expert witnesses, David Sugar, the professor of history from the University of Manchester, as being the CEO of the Royal Africa Company, and this was taken up by other witnesses as being the CEO of slavery. I do think that this perhaps should make us think a little bit more about who gets to be commemorated. And I do think that if you're in Shrewsbury and there is a statue of Robert Clive, then I do think there are things that we need to think about in terms of what's represented and how that affects the community at large.
Brian, I know you've done a lot recently, and actually there's an episode on the Aston Originals channel around Black history. Was anything that you've seen sort of in this case and maybe the build up to the trial, but also the fallout since it, that surprises you?
I think I was surprised at the reaction of people to the toppling of the statue. Surprised at the virulence of those people who criticised the verdict that the jury came to as well, and raised all sorts of questions about protection of property and breakdown in the rule of law and so on. But I think, that only goes to show the great complexity behind the issues here, and the issues are complex. If I can just drag us for a second onto a more historical footing, there's a long history of how people relate to statues and to public monuments. We're not the first generation to either pull monuments down or to transform or to change monuments. So I think we have to recognise that there's something paradoxical about statues, which is that they're far more fluid than they appear. They're fluid really in the public mind, because the public mind changes and the mentalities that surround them change. One of the things that just going back to the reaction to the verdict, one of the things that surprised me as well is that people care so much about these things, because my view would be that the vast majority of people walk past statues in city centres and barely give them a second thought. And in fact, the only statues that we really look at with any attention tend to be the ones connected to cenotaphs, to war memorials. Are there really any other public statues these days that we think about carefully? So those I think were the things that surprised me. But as I say, the surprise kind of points to the knot of problems that are underneath, the knot of problems that concern both how we understand the history of the slave trade, but also then the knot of problems that underpin civic history. And just linking back there to what Graeme was saying about who gets to be memorialised in the public square, I think that's perhaps that's a theme we can come back to.
Certainly will. I mean, you talked about things that surprised us. I think there was a lot of surprise from people, Graeme, that they were surprised that people were able to criminally damage something and, in their words, get away with it. But that's when you picked it up earlier. You used the term lawful excuse, which is obviously absolutely the right one in this case. Could you just explain that to people and maybe help those who think, well, you can't just go around damaging everything you like with no consequences?
Yeah. Okay. So I think first of all, the background and then perhaps just to say how that plays out in court. Some of the reaction to it, I think it was Grant Shapps, the Minister for Transport, who said, private property is sacrosanct. And what's interesting about that is that, I kind of criticism of the law is in fact that it's only there to safeguard private property, and therefore to safeguard wealth and privilege. There's a great quote from Anatole France going back to 1894, which says, the law applies equally to all. If you steal a loaf of bread, you'll be punished by the law, whether you're a rich man or a poor man. With, of course, the ironic underplaying that, why would a rich man ever steal a loaf of bread? And therefore that the law is biased towards protecting wealth, protecting property, and to punishing those who are without it. However, and you can say, yeah, okay, so Shapps is probably right. Yeah, the law is there to protect property. However, lawful excuse, and when it comes to criminal damage, there are very good reasons why somebody might lawfully destroy property. You can imagine a scenario where you walk past a parked car and imagine that there was a baby in the back of the car and the windows were closed and it was hot and the baby was struggling for oxygen. You would not look at that situation and say, well, I can't possibly break a window. And therefore, there is a lawful excuse to damaging property if you're able to demonstrate that you have a genuine belief that what you're doing is to prevent crime or in the name of public health. And it's up to the prosecution to disprove this. So if you genuinely and reasonably believe that you're acting proportionately to prevent a crime, it's up to the prosecution to disprove that rather than for you to prove it. So in this case, I think lots of people saw the video and so, well, they did it. So how is it that they got off? Well, it's not necessarily the fact of what they did. And this is quite typical of trials of activists. Trials of activists are much less about who did what, rather than the reasons why they did that and whether undertaking this action is justified, whether they had legal reasons for doing so. And therefore, activists try to convince juries, when they're able to get a jury trial, they try to convince jury that they acted in a way which was reasonable, which was proportionate, and which was justified. And that's what we had here. There was a video put together by the police, which showed from CCTV and social media footage what each of the defendants had done. And by and large, they didn't contest this. There was lots of discussion around details, but by and large, they didn't contest that it was them or that they were doing this. What they argued was that they had a lawful excuse for doing this. So in other words, though they did what they did, it was not an act of criminality. It was a lawful act because they had a reasonable justification in the prevention of crime, and that was to prevent a crime of public indecency or abusive public display. Those were the key prevention of crime arguments put forward.
Interesting. You mentioned Grant Shapps there, because I think he does also go by the name of Michael Green. But that's some homework for viewers and listeners to go and do. And let's have a look then, Brian. I think one of the questions that a lot of people may well be asking, and you're probably the right person to ask this, is how safe are statues in the UK, and are there any potentially in the firing line?
Well, there are statues in the firing line. Whilst I was preparing for this show, I came across an interesting website called Topple the Racists, a website which a crowdsourced website which tries to identify the sorts of statues that ought to be taken down. Topple the Racist, I think, is connected to the Stop Trump movement, which may yet have a revival, but that's another topic. So the Top of the Races website covers a whole host of statues right across the British Isles. Statues of people like Cecil Rhodes, but also Robert Peel, founder of the police, William Gladstone, normally seen as a paragon of virtue in the late 19th century. Clive of India, of course, and yes, lots of other individuals beside, who were connected to the slave trade or some of the more nefarious activities of the British Empire. So are those statues in danger? Well, perhaps they are. There was an interesting poll, though, that took place just after the incident in Bristol, and what the results of that poll showed was that about half of British people would be happy to see these statues go, maybe to be relocated in museums.
Is it about 52-48? Because we can't go there again.
Well, I think it's around 52% in favour in favour of them coming down and going into museums. there's a small percentage of those numbers. I think it was around 12 or 13% who actually wanted the statue taken down and completely destroyed.
Wow.
Which is another proposition altogether, and a rather interesting one, because one of the I suppose one of the difficulties, one of the snags of a website like that is that it sometimes doesn't actually make clear why this person or why this statue is being targeted. I happened to click on I think it's Birmingham. There's a marker on Birmingham, and it points to the statue of Robert Peel in Edgbaston. But when you click on the thing on the map and read what it says, the worst thing it accuses Robert Peel of is having been the son of someone who was in the slave trade. And okay, well, perhaps we can extrapolate and hypothesize, therefore, about how he benefited himself. But, if we're going to be condemned for the nefarious activities of our family members, then, that I don't know. The case needs to be more carefully constructed, I think, against the statues, which ought to be taken down. Now, Peel, has lots of other skeletons in the cupboard. Well, not even skeletons in the cupboard. I mean, he was openly hostile to Roman Catholics, for example, being taken back into Parliament in the 1820s. So, there's lots of other reasons that one might cite against him. But it's much more complex. I think that's the point that I'm trying to get at here. I mean, I think probably many of these statues are safe for now, because it takes quite a bit of effort, I think, to get up the kind of protest which is actually going to lasso a statue and pull it down.
I think that's really interesting, Brian. Just to pick up on that, there were a couple of things which came up in court. Is when one of the defendants said, you wouldn't have a statue of Jimmy Savile.
I was just about to bring that up. Very good.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that, again, that's really interesting, and that was a sense of the philanthropy, which is a lot of what of the defenders of Edward Colston pointed to, and really making the point that actually we do reassess and we do reappropriate, and there is a sense there that some things are abusive, are indecent. And so that kind of, and I think that had said we were above the jury, but you could feel the temperature in court change. You could sense the change in the quality of the silence. But the other thing was that in the closing speeches, so this was because the trial was kind of in abeyance over Christmas, and we came back for 2 days at the end. And in the closing speech, one of the defense QCs said, what would the prosecution have been doing at the fall of the Berlin Wall? They'd have been standing there with their trowel and their mortar, worrying about red tape and saying, oh, it'll be Hadrian's Wall next. And that clearly went down really well in court. And one of the things that Brian's saying, and we've said in discussion, Sam, is that this is a very Bristol type affair.
Yeah, completely agree.
We have to place this in the context of criticisms of this statue, which go back to the 1920s, and consistent campaigning against this statue would certainly go back 30 years. And probably people who are listening will be aware that Massive Attack refused to play Colston Hall in I think it was about 1997 because of its name. And so much of Bristol bore the name of Edward Colston. But immediately after the statue was pulled down, those institutions also changed their names. And to give one example of this, 1 week later, Bristol Cathedral covered up part of a pane of a stained glass window, because it was a stained glass window about the Good Samaritan. And it bore a dedication to Edward Colston for being like the Good Samaritan. And so this had been a long debate, which had clearly structured a lot of discussion within Bristol and about the identity of Bristol. But it was only after this action took place, only after I was going to say activists, but really there were about 3,000 people there around the statue when it was hauled down by, you know, a relatively large number of people. So about 15 or 20 people were participating in pulling it down, not just these four. It was only after that that created that kind of movement, but this was building on a long-standing debate and point of controversy, and I don't think we've got similar conditions elsewhere in Britain.
Yeah, it does seem that way, doesn't it? It's like all of these learnings and conversations that happen post criminal damage are ones that should be had before statues go up in the first place. But there's a good pull quote from the conversation article. Link is in the description. The fourth defendant encouraged others to roll it to the docks across the cobbles where, as he said in the witness box, so many had been dragged against their will centuries before. One of those times where the mood almost changed, I suppose, Graeme.
Yeah.
But Brian, when we look at historical learnings potentially from this, and there's a couple of points to this next question, if you don't mind, what are the historical learnings here? How important will this case be in helping shape how history is taught? And then there's a quote just finally from Sage Willoughby from the Colston Four. This is a victory for Bristol. This is a victory for racial equality, and it's a victory for anybody who wants to be on the right side of history. How will this be recorded in history, and who's going to be writing the history book? Sorry, there's quite a lot there, so if you want me to go through them bit by bit again, then I will.
Okay, let me tiptoe my way through those. Through those questions.
There's a lot there, so lots to digest. Sorry.
As best I can. Look, I'll come to what I think is a topic which has been hovering there behind things that both I and Graeme have been talking about, and it's something that schools and universities ought to seriously look at teaching and incorporating into curricula, and that's the functions of civic history, and also the distinctions between civic history and, let's call it, academic history, because I think they do have different functions. I think that's a matter of fact, that they do have different functions and effects. On the side of academic history, one of the things that this incident, the Colston statue, brings very much to the foreground is the importance of embedding a better understanding of British history in a global context within our curricula. Salman Rushdie said the British don't understand their history because most of it took place overseas, which is I think that's a rather nice way of putting it. Nothing much happened here in the British Isles, but it was very busy in India and in the Caribbean. But Brits don't know it, and this is a rule that should be applied to our school curricula and to our university curricula as well. Now, I think this is just two things. One is that intellectually, actually, that's a more enriching way to understand your history in the first place. But secondly, it also fits in with the fact that Britain is a changing nation, and it's much more diverse than it was. And one of the reasons it's diverse is because many of the migrants who have come here from former British colonies. With other colleagues at the moment, I'm working on a little project on Indian partition, and this is one of the moments of migration into Britain was the Indian partition, and then some migrants came through Africa and then to Britain. But this is all part of our backstory. And why don't British people know it, or why don't they understand it, or why do they only have a very primitive awareness of these sorts of realities? It's extraordinary how tub thumping people can still be about Britain and yet not understand that Britain has been this massive global player and the implications that has for ordinary people on the other side of the planet. So that's on the academic history side. Coming to the question of civic history, civic history does have sorry, let me just say one more thing about the academic history just before I go to the civic history. The statue defenders would benefit greatly from knowing more of that global history I was talking about, that Britain in a global world. And I think some of the objections to the damage to the statue, some of those objections are drawn in by the vacuum of ignorance about that past. These statues are not meaningful, and therefore people put a meaning on them and say, oh, well, it's property, that's why you can't have a go at it. And they don't know the story. If only they did know the story, there would be no vacuum. There would be no vacuum that drew those stupid arguments out of them. There we go. That's just my view. Now, coming to the civic history, I think we don't often reflect on the fact that civic history does have a different function from academic history. In the popular imagination, civic history is real history, and history is the past. And the past is history, but what they don't understand is that history is an account of the past and is necessarily always partial. So what's its point? Well, in the civic domain, its point is to help bind people together. And I think here, this is where perhaps both sides make a mistake, actually, both the enemies of the statues and the defenders of the statues. The defenders of the statues, because if they don't have their eye on what a changing country they're in, it's no wonder that they don't understand that this statue can no longer be, if it ever was, a sign of unity. It's now a sign of division. But also, I think for the enemies of the statues, for those that would topple the statues, there has to be some sort of understanding of the norms of civic history. If you smash civic history, then what are you saying about civic unity? What are you saying? It's a power play, and you can say, well, it's a justified power play, or it's no wonder because these people have been wrongly treated, but it's still a power play. So how democratic is it? I think various people have been upset by that, and should Colston statue have come down? Yes, but in the same way that I object to people screaming in my face, I might also object to people ripping down things without my consent. And I don't know. I think what I'm trying to say here is that the civic space has to be carefully managed. The danger is that if it's just left to or if we simply justify those kinds of initiatives without further understanding the implications, we could set dangerous precedents. And I think that's worth thinking about.
Graeme, you obviously wrote the article a couple of weeks ago now in the conversation. I just wanted to see what the reaction had been like since it was published. It's been read thousands of times, and I'm guessing you would have had a reaction from people who either agree or disagree with you. You put it on Twitter, always a mistake, but the damage is done. But what was it like? What was the reaction like in general? If you give us a brief overview.
I think, to be honest, we've tried to stay away from getting involved, from getting dragged in. As they say, never go below the line. We've had about 100 comments on the article and the conversation, which is certainly new territory for anything I've ever written.
Well, it's a lot of comments, that is.
Yeah. So, but mostly that was men, and I think you can draw your own conclusions from that, arguing about which statues were legitimate and which ones weren't legitimate. And I think that, that's the kind of perhaps argument which those types of forums are particularly ill-suited to having that kind of complex and nuanced debate. And I do think that, one of the lessons from what happened in Bristol is that this was very much a result rather than an outcome of activism. In other words, Brian introduced the subject about democratic thinking. I think thinking about this democratically is actually really important, particularly in the context of a changing community. which Brian's also brought up. I think those are things I'd like to really keep in tension, is that when we're thinking about what liberal democracy is, liberal political theory would argue that the way that we take decisions cannot simply be about majoritarianism, can't simply be the greatest good of the greatest number, and that we have to think about the place of minorities of whatever stripe within any decisions that we take. And this has really been something, if we kind of take a broader look at the political landscape since the end of the Cold War, the notion of civic rights has become increasingly central to our politics, and we've seen this in the way that it's been translated through the Human Rights Act in 1997, through the Equalities Act, through the Gender Recognition Act, and so on and so forth. But a lot of the debate and a lot of the reaction to the felling of this statue has been about, well, all you need to do is to keep working democratically, and that it should be the majority voices which prevail. I don't think there's much of a sense there about how power and democracy are intertwined, and how difficult it is, even in a place like Bristol, even in a place where there is a black mayor, Marvin Rees, for instance, even in a place like Bristol, for minority rights to be respected in this type of civic representation. One of the things which came across a lot in the courtroom was the idea of this from the testimony of different witnesses, that this statue wasn't just some kind of backdrop, it was a material intervention into everyday life. And a lot of people talked about how painful it was to be a Bristolian, particularly to be a black Bristolian, or to be a Bristolian who fully believes that we live in a multicultural, multi-ethnic community, and to see this statue of Edward Colston in the centre of the city. And I think, the reason that this has lasted 30 years and that we didn't get this plaque is because there's a lack of kind of procedural justice that's going on here. That this was bogged down through blocking, through the Society of Merchant Venturers, through political opposition, that they couldn't even agree or get agreement around basic facts and understanding of what it was that Colston had actually done. So words like trafficking or transporting, words like slaves or Africans, words like torture and death and murder could not be settled on to be part of this new plaque to try to contextualize it. So even the idea here that we could contextualize this plaque, this statue, ran aground over an absence of agreement or an absence of majority feeling, that they were prepared to admit what slavery was, how it affected people, how many people died, how black people were subjected to the most horrific brutality, sexual violence, torture, being thrown overboard, the conditions in which they were kept on these slave ships, the conditions in which they were kept on plantations in the West Indies. And it's that inability to marry that to what is ostensibly a democratic process. In other words, a democratic process wasn't producing outcomes which respected minority rights and minority feelings within Bristol. And that seems to me where this idea that we can simply rely on a democratic process runs aground, when that democratic process is no longer capable of integrating minority rights.
Brian, I was pick up on that point actually.
Yeah.
Obviously, France, for example, obviously a place that you're very familiar with. If I speak to my French friends, they say, how do you expect to get anything done without setting something on fire? Have they got a point?
They do, and in fact, as Graeme well knows, being himself historically
arsonist,
a French specialist, there is a very grand tradition of direct action, l'action directe. And I'm just thinking of the last few years of the 18th century, when the French militants were really getting going. I think it's very interesting what Graeme was just saying about power and democracy. But I think here, a historical eye on this does also help us and also maybe challenge as well. Some of the arguments around the whole issue. The reason that statue toppling got so popular in the last few years goes back to the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which begins in South Africa, at the University of Cape Town. And then, there's a wave across the world. And of course, there's the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Oxford and so on. What's interesting about the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in South Africa is that it broke out 2 decades after the end of apartheid. And from a historical point of view, I think this is rather interesting. I'm interested why in 1995, 96, the black people of South Africa didn't go tearing down the Cecil Rhodes statues or monuments and the other kind of colonial monuments that were there. So, I think that's worth thinking about, particularly when we assume that all the members of a minority, of an ethnic minority, might feel the same way about these things, because that to me seems historically questionable. Just another interesting factoid about Cecil Rhodes, about the Cecil Rhodes statue. According to what I've read, the first people to complain about the Cecil Rhodes statues weren't blacks at all. They were actually Afrikaners, because Rhodes was nasty to the Afrikaners, like he was nasty to the blacks as well. So, I agree with Graham's argument that people can take offense at these things, but I'd be less certain. And again, just as I say, from a historical point of view, it's not so certain that everyone within a particular ethnicity will react in the same way to these symbols, and that in itself raises questions about how it is that these symbols even operate, and the kind of maps of symbolism that they create, and how, going back to a point I made earlier, how fluid they can be in themselves. Well, Sam, you're on mute.
Look at that. It's very impressional. Very, very interesting learnings there. And, a really, really interesting conversation. So what I'd like to do is, starting with you, Graeme, for anybody, who's listening to this or watching this and thinks, this is sociology is something that I want to maybe look into doing as a career. I want to go and study at university, could well be at Aston University. What's the pitch?
I think one of the pitches actually is that collective action is a really fascinating aspect of our social life. And I was just thinking that if you go back to pre-modern times, there was a form of collective action called rough music, where those who had brought shame upon the community were identified and had ritual punishments applied to them. And this was common across, Western Europe and to a certain extent North America. E.P. Thompson wrote about it. You got this identity, all these rituals, all these humiliations were applied physically, being sat backwards on a donkey and paraded through town, having pots and pans being banned all night outside their house. And that kind of direct type of community action was taken or fell into disuse as we suddenly got integrated markets, parliamentarization, industrialization, technology states, and so on and so forth. And there were different kind of channels for aggregating opinion and for trying to change the world around you. I think it's really interesting that we see this here, such as the fact that all of those normal, regular democratic channels had not worked, had not produced anything. And there's something actually quite symbolic about, you mentioned the rolling of this statue across the cobbles where so many had been dragged against their will before them and dumped into the harbour. And I think this tells us a lot actually about the nature of power in the society that we live in, and what comes to the fore every now and again as a way of expressing to us that perhaps we live in a less equal and less open and less transparent and less plural society than perhaps we think we do. And that really is the very base of what sociology is trying to look at. How do people come together to express their collective agency in order to remediate what is wrong, what is unfair, what is unjust, and what is unequal? And it seems to me that actually in the trial of the Colston Four and in the action that preceded it, that prompted it, there's a lot here that sociologists can properly get their teeth into.
Brian, for those future historians, the ones that could potentially be writing the history books, message for them? Oh, you're on mute now. We're all taking it in turns.
That's because in true COVID style, someone just came to my door and rang the bell, and I've had to ignore them. So, look, you know, what's the good thing about the tearing down of the Colston statue is that it's triggered lots and lots of discussion about this lesser known side of British history, and that's, I think, a very, very good thing. You know, when if students are looking at you know what history course they might study at university, well then, you know, they should be looking for a course which allows them to learn British history, but in a global context. Because just going back to the Salman Rushdie quotation, the British don't know their history because it happened elsewhere. Surely now, you know, we're nearly 60 years into that phase that Marshall McLuhan called the global village. We ought to be more informed about that wider arena of history, and bring a global perspective on that history, even to these local questions, like the question of the Colston statue in Birmingham, or indeed the statue of Robert Peel in Edgbaston, or Horatio Nelson down in the Bullring. There we go. I think that's probably my message for the future. This will make a very interesting history as well. I think, you know, it'll be a revealing history. It may even be seen in some historians' eyes later on as a watershed moment. Let's hope so. When British people became more aware, even if only slowly, that they had to start opening other books of history that told them about the things that they don't know about themselves.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Nelson, Brian, because, you know, I think there's a very small number of people who know that there's a statue of Nelson in the centre of Birmingham. Perhaps an even smaller number who can work out what the connection between Birmingham and Nelson is, and an even smaller number of people who understand Nelson's role within the slave trade. And, you know, which probably explains why Nelson never became a target of any kind of local mobilization during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020.
Yeah. And historians in 50 years' time, and historians are looking back at this, they'll have to look at why these symbols kind of flickered with different meanings that are sometimes so controversial and at other times, you know, so anodyne or even neutral. As I say, most people just walk by and don't even give them a second look.
Brian, do you feel a little bit sorry for those historians that are going to be there in 50 years' time, going to be looking back at the 2016 referendum, looking back at coronavirus, the Black Lives Matter movement, the falling of statues? There's going to be a real buffet, isn't there, of stuff that they can look back on. Is that exciting, or do you think, oh, I'm glad it's not me? Although you've lived through it, so I don't know what's worse.
Historians see disaster like politicians It's a question of opportunity. The archive should be full. No, I think the problem will be that since much of our life takes place online, the problem will be chasing down the evidence. Much more difficult to archive the internet, although I suppose it'll all still be there.
Give us a ring in 50 years' time, Sam.
We'll be here. Yeah, we'll join you the same time in 50 years. Well, excellent. Well, we'll say goodbye to Graeme Hayes, Brian Sudlow. If you are a tweeter, they are both on Twitter. Aston SAP, I think, for sociology and policy. Aston SSH for the entire school, and then we've got Aston History as well. So go and check them out and look at some of the great work that's going on at Aston University. But otherwise, we'll say goodbye and see you next time.